Hey guys, in today's video, we're going to be looking at the importance of using a high quality furnace filter and why you should never skimp out. This guy doesn't know what he's talking about. What is going on here? Here, let me teach you. Hey there, I'm Matt, and in today's video, we're looking at whether these expensive furnace filters may actually be making your system work harder and eventually costing you more money than just using these cheap filters. We'll be pitting these 4 filters up against each other, ranging from our cheap fiberglass filter through the more expensive pleated filters. And each of these filters has a different MERV rating, so I'm going to be collecting data to see just how much they affect the performance of our HVAC system. And at the end of our testing, we're going to find out whether a cheaper filter is the key to achieving better comfort, more energy savings, and overall better performance than the more expensive filters. So let's get going. We've lived in our house now for over 15 years, and in the early stages, I had a love-hate relationship with our furnace. A big part of our problem had been the inefficiency during heating and cooling. It seemed the AC or the heat would constantly run just to hit even a moderate set point. Well, there's many different factors that go into the performance of a furnace, some of which are going to be more difficult to address. One of the easiest things to look at is the filter. Do we have the right filter in there that's going to give us the best performance out of our system? And that's what we're going to be looking at. As we stroll through the filter aisle in the store, it's easy to assume by looking at the prices that the more expensive filters must be better for our HVAC systems and our homes. However, in many cases, the more expensive filters can actually restrict airflow, which can ultimately do more harm than good when it comes to performance of the system. And lower MERV filters are generally going to be cheaper than the higher MERV filters. They're going to allow more dust and particulate to pass through, but they're also going to allow more airflow. And that airflow is key because that's what's going to get you more efficiency in your heating and cooling. That's going to reduce the amount of strain on the blower motor. And overall, it'll just allow for better temperature control and comfort in the house. And on the contrary, the higher MERV filters, they're going to do a much better job of filtering things through the air, dust, pollen, things like that. So there's trade-offs between the cheaper and the more expensive filters, but in the end, it's all about finding the right filter and seeing how each filter can affect the system performance. And when it comes to filters and MERV ratings, think of this analogy. A really thick milkshake, what's going to be easier to drink it with? A really thin straw or a really wide straw? The wide straw is going to require much less effort. Same goes with filters. A higher MERV rating or a tighter filter is going to require much more effort out of the blower than a lower MERV rating that's going to allow more air to pass through easier. And with that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a closer look at each of the filters we're going to be testing today. After rating my local Menards, I came home with these 4 furnace filters. They're all the same dimensions, 1 inch thick, 16 by 25, made to fit in the filter channel of our furnace. We've got our fiberglass filter here, and then 3 pleated filters over here. So let's first glance at our fiberglass filter. This is a MERV 2, $1.99 at Menards. We've got a 16% particle removal efficiency from 3 to 10 microns, so kind of the larger particles. 16% is really pretty low. And then we've got our airflow characteristics here. And the last thing to note with this fiberglass filter is it's rated with a 30-day filter life. We've got the MERV 8 from Best Air. This is a pleated filter, $5.99 at Menards, so more than double the price of the fiberglass, but it does last 3 times as long. We can remove up to 75% of airborne particulates in the 3 to 10 micron range, and it does remove basic allergens, pollen, ragweed, and then some of the finer particulates. And now we've got our MERV 11 from Best Air, another pleated filter, lasts up to 90 days. This one was $12 at Menards. And this one, with the MERV 11 rating, can remove up to 85% of the particulates. And in addition to everything the MERV 8 could cover, this one covers even more with mold spores, smoke, viruses, bacteria, odor. And then the last filter we're going to be testing goes all the way up to MERV 13, again from Best Air. It's a pleated filter, lasts up to 90 days. This one was $21 at Menards. And this one can remove up to 96% of particulates, and it can do everything the MERV 11 covers, plus smog. And we all love these cheesy analogies, so we're using kitchenware just to visualize when it comes to filter efficiency and flow restrictions. Obviously, our MERV 2, more flow, less filtration, And so we could probably filter out some berries here with this strainer lid, but anything smaller is going to flow through. Then we've got our MERV 8. We've got a pasta colander. We can strain out pasta. If we're trying to strain out rice, that's going to fall through. And then we've got our MERV 11 filter. We've got a sifter here. This is good at removing bigger clumps of flour and sugar, but it's going to eventually allow the finer particles to pass through. And then we've got our MERV 13. This will catch the coffee grounds, but it's definitely going to be more restrictive. It's going to take a while for the water to filter through. So kind of similar in concept. As we move across the different MERVs and the different kitchen utensils, we're going to have more filtration as we get higher up, but also more restriction. So you might be wondering, okay, how are we going to test these filters? Well, with some instrumentation, of course. We've got our digital manometer here to allow us to measure static pressure. We've got our anemometer allowing us to measure airflow. And then we've got some really fancy meat thermometers to allow us to measure temperature. So the combination of these are going to allow us to gauge impact of the filter on our furnace performance. And so just a quick note, as we're taking measurements, I am not going to spend time analyzing each individual data point or absolute value. So if I'm getting a static pressure of 0.3 inches on our MERV 2, not really going to mean much until I have a chance to compare it to the statics of the other filters. And a big part of that is because everybody's HVAC system is designed differently between ductwork, furnace sizing. Those are all factors that can impact the measurements that we're getting. So what we're trying to do is just isolate the impact of the filter by doing a comparison between each of the measurements. Probably the single most important tool that we're going to be using today is the manometer. This is going to allow us to measure static pressure inside of our furnace. This is a very handy tool anytime you're trying to diagnose furnace issues or furnace performance. You can take measurements at various points throughout the furnace. So what we're going to be using this for today is really measuring kind of the inlet to the blower. So it's downstream of the filter, upstream of the blower. And this, again, going back to that milkshake analogy, is going to give us indication of how hard or how much restriction is there when the blower is trying to move air through the system. And a lot of that depends on the upstream components, including the filter. And with static pressure, furnaces generally will have a rating somewhere on them, on the nameplate or in the manual, that indicates kind of that ideal static pressure of the furnace itself. When it came out of the factory, what was it designed to operate at to achieve ideal performance? Many furnaces come equipped with ports that allow you to place the static pressure probe inside various locations. Ours has multiple ports here. The one we're going to be using is actually down here. This is on the fan inlet or the blower inlet side. So this is after the filter, before the blower. So we'll be monitoring this pressure here. We're not really concerned about absolute values. We're going to be really just trying to compare as we switch between filters, what sort of change are we seeing? And if you've never used a manometer before, it may sound a little more complicated than it actually is. They're relatively simple to use. This one was 30 bucks on Amazon. It's a very basic one, but it has 2 ports at the top. So I could actually be taking 2 measurements at once, and it'll calculate the differential between the 2 static pressure readings. In my case, I'm only going to be using 1 port because I'm really just interested in measuring the suction side static pressure so that I can gauge impact between the different filters. And so to use this when using a manometer, it's important that we zero out the reading before we start measuring. And then what I can do is just take my static probe and place it here inside the test port. Now that we have our manometer ready for measurement, we're going to go ahead and get our anemometer ready for measurement. And this is a relatively simple tool, again, maybe 30, 40 bucks on Amazon. It allows us to measure airflow speed. Could be wind speed, or in our case, we're going to be measuring speed coming out of a supply register. To help ensure I was consistent with my measurement process, I used a little piece of wood along with some painter's tape just to make sure that I was keeping the instrument at the same distance, same location at our supply register. And to use our anemometer, we will be positioning it up against a supply register. And what will happen is when the furnace is on and air is blowing through, it's going to spin around. The faster the speed, that means the more air that we're moving through and the less restriction we have at the furnace. And then lastly, we're going to be measuring temperature using our meat thermometers. These are going to be positioned at the supply and return side of our furnace, allowing us to calculate the temperature difference or the delta across the furnace. We're going to be running in heat mode because it is cold outside, and so the furnace is rated with a maximum delta of 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's going to differ based on different furnaces, but that's what ours is. And so if the difference between our inlet and outlet side of the furnace exceeds 65 degrees Fahrenheit, it's going to trip a limit, burners are going to shut off, it's going to have to cool, fan will continue to run, and then overall it's just inefficient. So what we're going to do is use these thermometers to gauge kind of the impact of each filter on the delta. So with one of our thermometers, we'll be positioning it here in this hole on our supply ductwork. We'll just let it hang there, and then we can grab the reading as we switch out each filter. And then on the return side, got a hole in this duct. Just go ahead and slide the other thermometer in, allow it to dangle, and then we can go ahead and take the reading on the return side. And between the supply and return measurements, we can calculate that delta. And so first up for testing is going to be our MERV 2 fiberglass filter. For the testing, I want to make sure the burners are on, so I'm bumping the thermostat up to 70 degrees to ensure we're heating throughout the entirety of our testing. For each filter, I'll let the furnace run for 5 minutes before I take measurements. All right, we just hit 5 minutes. Going to take our readings. Static pressure, 0.40, 0.41 for our MERV 2. Supply temperature, 129.2. Return temperature, 73.4. Airflow of about, let's call it 660. We'll split the difference. I'll log my readings in our handy dandy notebook, and then I'm going to just repeat the process for the rest of the filters. These really are cheap filters. So kind of interesting, going from the MERV 8 to the MERV 11, pretty much right away our temperature limit switch tripped on the furnace. So that shut down the heating, fan had to run for about 5 minutes to cool the system off. And what that tells me is after even just the MERV 8, it was kind of pushing our system to the limits as far as airflow and being able to circulate enough air to keep that temperature from rising to the limit. So I think with our system, there's definitely some other aspects that are hindering performance. That said, let's get back to testing this MERV 11. Now that we have the data, we can go ahead and start our comparison of the 4 filters against each other. And after spending tedious amounts of time analyzing the data, I'm just kidding, data was really evident. Unsurprisingly, the MERV 2 provided the best airflow, least amount of static. But even though the MERV 2 did have the best airflow, it's still worthwhile to do a comparison to see this fiberglass MERV 2 versus our pleated MERV 8. Let's just see how much of a difference we had. And looking at the results, MERV 2 resulted in 25% less static and about 10% more airflow than the MERV 8. While this may not seem all that significant, we're going to see just how big of an impact it had on our temperature delta here shortly. Now if we pit the MERV 8 against the MERV 11 and 13, we see that the MERV 8 had 15% less static and 5% more airflow than the two higher rated filters. And speaking of which, the MERV 11 and 13, that was a bit of a surprise. Both filters had pretty much identical static and airflow readings, and I'm assuming this may be due to differences in the pleat design or filter material, and I plan to have a separate video that's going to dive into this further. And as mentioned earlier, our furnace has a temperature limit of 65 degrees Fahrenheit, meaning if the difference between the supply and the return exceeds 65 degrees, the burners are going to shut off, fan's going to continue to run, it's going to be inefficient essentially. And what we saw here is our MERV 2 remained around 10 degrees lower than that 65 degree limit. So plenty of bandwidth to hopefully not hit that limit. Whereas the pleated filters, we saw those deltas hover right around the 65 degree mark. And with our comparisons, we saw the MERV 2 resulted in a delta of about 15% cooler than the MERV 8, and our MERV 8 was about 5% cooler than the MERV 11 and 13. And we can see how the lower deltas correlated with the higher airflows and the lower statics. Ultimately, the airflow characteristics that we saw with the MERV 2 were the ideal ones that prevented us from tripping that limit switch like we did with the pleated. And even beyond the heating cycle, similar issue can still occur even during cooling cycles. You can essentially not have enough of the warm air circulating over the coil, coils freeze up, you get a block of ice, and then you're really restricting airflow and really hindering performance. So really isn't just a heating issue, it can also be a cooling issue by restricting airflow too much. So ultimately, after going through this testing, I've pretty much confirmed that my furnace is really only going to be able to handle the cheapo MERV 2 fiberglass filters. Maybe I can get up to a MERV 3, 4, 5. I could test that. But these pleated filters that are up in the MERV 8, 11, 13 range, it's going to cause issues for my system. And even without factoring in my HVAC system's specific constraints, the testing does go to show that these cheaper filters do improve airflow and can help with furnace performance. And with the higher airflow that we're getting from the cheaper filter, what this is going to do is it's going to help keep rooms heated evenly. It's going to reduce strain on the furnace blower, increasing longevity of it, and it may also reduce the energy bill. However, like anything, there are some downsides. The cheap filters are not going to do much to improve air quality, and they're going to require more frequent cleaning of furnace components. You're going to have that dirt that's going to pass through the filter, it's going to go through the blower, going to go on the AC coil. So you're going to want to make sure to clean those components out more frequently. And then at the same time, you're going to need to also change that filter out more frequently. It doesn't have very much surface area, so as soon as it starts getting some of the bigger dust and debris on it, that airflow is going to become more and more restricted quicker. And then looking at the more expensive and more efficient filters, obviously the big benefit here is they are going to do a much better job getting rid of the dirt and debris from the air. It's going to keep the furnace components cleaner, less maintenance around that. It's also going to help improve indoor air quality. So those are two big benefits with the more restrictive filters. And as we've touched on, big downfalls with the more efficient filters is that you're going to have airflow restriction, which can reduce the heating and cooling efficiency. You may end up with a higher energy bill. And then your furnace is going to be working harder to move air through the system. You may increase your temperature delta, cause overheating, and have limit switches that trip as well, along with risk of damaging the heat exchanger. And keep in mind, many HVAC systems, especially the newer ones, they're designed to handle MERV 8, MERV 10, maybe even MERV 13 filters without issue. A lot of the systems now have thicker filters, thicker than these 1-inch ones, so you're getting more surface area, allowing more air to flow through while still capturing the debris. But ultimately, I think it's worth taking some readings and really checking out what filter is going to work best for your system. And also know that MERV ratings are not standardized to correlate with a specific pressure drop, a static, or an airflow. There's definitely variation that can be found amongst filters of the same MERV rating from different manufacturers. So just something to keep in mind as you're choosing filters. One MERV 8 is not always going to be the same as another MERV 8. And if you're in a similar situation as me, where you pretty much need to use a low MERV filter in order for your furnace to perform properly, here's some quick tips to consider. First off, we need to increase the furnace cleaning frequency, since low MERV filters are going to allow more dust to build up inside the equipment. And if you're looking to achieve better air quality inside, you can always consider getting one of those standalone air purifiers. A lot of them have the HEPA filtration in it, where you're actually going to get cleaner air than you would out of a MERV 11 or 13 filter. And especially with the fiberglass filters where you have less surface area, it's going to be imperative that you change that filter out frequently, because as soon as dust and debris starts to build up on the surface of it, you're going to see that airflow restriction hit. All right, we've gone through the data. Let me know down in the comments below, is it best to go with these cheap filters that are going to get you more airflow but not catch as much dirt and debris? Or should we be considering these more restrictive, better filtration filters? And hopefully you found this content useful. If so, please consider liking and subscribing. I've got a ton more content planned around HVAC testing and other projects around the house.